The winningest team in baseball also has the most saves, and people who save the most money are winners. So start earning saves by investing in worthy bonds for only $10 each. These bonds earn a fixed 7% APY, and there's no fees, penalties, or minimum balance required, and they can be redeemed whenever you like. You can even round up everyday purchases to buy additional bonds. Go to worthybonds.com/save. That's worthybonds.com/save and save and win.
Welcome to Let's Talk About It with Janelle King, and I am Janelle King, and this is where we discuss these kitchen table topics that could be banned from family gatherings, but they are extremely necessary for a strong republic. And last week, I talked about the tensions between U.S. and China and just how we got here, where it all started. I gave you some background on that. But during the show, I mentioned a comment that was made by Nikita Khrushchev, who is a former leader of the Soviet Union. He was there from 1954 to around 1964. And the statement he made was that we will take America without firing a shot. We do not have to invade the U.S. We will destroy from within, is something that he said. And I proceeded to kind of share how I believe that China has been operating under this same concept. You know, we've seen this when we begin to examine the Belt and Roads Initiative. There's been a lot of conversation around cyber espionage and intellectual property theft. And then, of course, there's the whole disinformation and influence on operations. And we have TikTok, right? So TikTok is a topic that we've all talked about, and just how China has utilized TikTok in order to kind of send messages. And this is what we think is happening, is that there's kind of sending messages to our young people particularly. And the messages that they're sending to us are not the messages they're sending to their young people. So we had a problem about that. But I really want to talk about this mainly because I feel like our younger generation is left out of the discussion. I feel like we're just not really going deep. And as the list continues to go on and on and on of ways that I are seeing China implement their attacks, I call them, on our country, as I stated, I think our younger generation is not really seeing it, because when we think of war, we typically think of military, we think of men on the ground, we think of shooting and deaths and all this other stuff. But there's different types of warfare. And so I wanted to introduce that to our younger generation. And I ended the show talking about China and our US Surrogacy program. And this came about because I was actually at a conference, and when I bring in our guests, we can talk about that a little bit more, but I was at a conference and I met her dad, and we just had conversation around just various topics. And he, like a proud father, mentioned his daughter and sent us her article, and I read it. And I was blown away. So if you want to hear the last show and all of that, you can go to allthingsjking.com. That's allthingsjking.com to listen to the last show. But today, we are talking to the author of the article that really drew me in, Miss Emma Waters, and she's with us. Hey, Emma, how are you?
Hi, Janelle. I'm doing great. Thank you for such a kind introduction.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. And so the name of the article was, I think it was California's new Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
And I thought that was so cool because, for one, I did like the show. I found it very interesting. But yeah, so what inspired you to discuss this particular topic?
Yeah, so a couple of months ago, NPR actually released a very short story talking about the nanny ward industry in California. Mm-hmm. And so this nanny ward industry refers to Chinese nannies in this instance who had homes with up to 12 newborn infants at a time that they were taking care of around the clock. Because the parents of these newborns in the United States were actually Chinese nationals who lived in China. And at the time that this article was covering, we were still still in many of the COVID travel restrictions that made it impossible for Chinese citizens to travel to the United States to pick up these kids. So all of a sudden you see popping up across the state of California, in particular, children who were left without their parents and without the mother who birthed them as a gestational surrogate, and were instead being cared for by these third-party nannies who, quite frankly, were overwhelmed by the number of kids that they had. And it really struck me at that moment that, one, I had been covering reproductive technology through my job for a while and looking into commercial surrogacy. And there are no consistent federal laws that govern commercial surrogacy. And on the state level, it really is varied state by state, but most don't really have laws governing it. Instead, they just rely on family court law. So who has the rights of parentage over the children? But none of the laws really address the complexity of kids who are being born whose genetic biological parents live thousands upon thousands of miles away to a surrogate who's technically only paid to carry the child and birth it, who has no responsibility to care for the child once it's born, and is now being paid by yet another woman to care for them in the absence of parents. And so this just seems like, one, it just showed how incredibly lax and insufficient many of our laws were governing surrogacy. But when we're talking about surrogacy, we're talking about the creation and birth of life, of a new child. And so it struck me that even if these children are not American by their ethnicity, we still have a moral obligation to care for the children that are born here. And so really the question of what that looks like and what it looks like to care for children and be morally responsible towards them really struck me. And then on top of that, this was not an issue that, aside from a few NPR articles, had really been covered. And it seemed like a glaring gap in our conversations around China and what it looks like to counter the 21st century threat that China is.
Oh, my goodness. So, okay, so just for the listeners, but also for me, are we saying that these surrogates are giving birth and then they're handing them to the nannies who's taking them to these homes?
So in the instances in COVID in particular, so normal practice would be that the parents fly in around the time of the birth, and usually it's a scheduled C-section, so they know what to expect, and that they pick up the child as soon as it's born. And so first, it's important to note that the surrogate is the only person, the only mother that child knows for its entire existence in the womb. So when you're adopting a pet, for example, like a puppy, you have to wait 8 to 12 weeks before you're allowed to take that puppy away from its mother, because that time of bonding with the only other person or the only other animal that dog has ever known, right, is so essential for the development of the dog. And the same is much more true for humans. And yet in the case of surrogacy, intended parents, are allowed to take the child within hours of the birth, which actually causes severe psychological issues, or can cause severe psychological issues later on, because all of a sudden the child is stripped from the only sense of home or protection or safety that it knows, without any real ability to perceive the world. So often parents will come in flying internationally to pick up the children right away. But in the instance of China's COVID travel restriction laws, I actually spoke to a few labor and delivery nurses who said that the surrogacy organizations in the U.S. were scrambling to find people who could pick them up in lieu of the parents. And so there were some instances where they were even hiring family members of the agencies to come and take care of the kids temporarily, or they were picking them up but then handing them off to nannies. And we can hope that this was all done legally and above the board with the proper paperwork. But there are instances that the nurses told me about in California where they would even just have men coming to claim the children, asking the surrogates to bring the child to the parking lot so that they could take them to the nanny ward until the parents could come. And thankfully, the nurses were able to intercept this whole procedure before it went down. But this is the sort of just like unregulated market that the surrogacy industry tends to breed, because like you said, in that instance, if the parents can't come, then they really are scrambling to try to find a backup alternative that is hopefully legal and safe for the child.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking to Emma Waters, who wrote the article California's New Handmaid's Tale, which was so intriguing and riveting to me because I didn't know this was going on as it relates to China and our US surrogacy program. Now, in the article, you discussed a shift from the traditional birth tourism criticism to using American surrogates by wealthy Chinese nationals. Well, other than the obvious, right, that it's cheaper and a little bit faster, I'm assuming. Did your research lead you into any other factors that can contribute to this drastic change?
Yeah, so it's amazing how honest people are on the internet, especially. And so when I was researching this, looking at the transition from birth tourism to this international surrogacy business, one thing that I found consistently was that where with birth tourism, for example, a woman travels to the United States around her 8th month of pregnancy and gives birth. And the incentive that she has to do that in the United States in particular is because with the U.S.'s birthright citizenship laws, if you're born in the U.S., you gain and maintain the full rights of U.S. citizenship for the entirety of your life, unless you were to give them up for some reason. And so when it comes to U.S. surrogates, like you said, there's a whole new way now that parents from foreign countries can actually ensure that their child has citizenship. And so in the instance of surrogacy, you have to create an embryo using the egg and sperm of either the parents who are going to pick up the child, or they can purchase them in the United States through what's oftentimes a very sketchy sperm and egg donation process. And they create the child. And so one Chinese father in particular said something to the effect of, if you know what you want and you have enough money, you can get anything you want in the United States. And what he was referring to is the fact that in order to get a legitimate visa or citizenship in the U.S., it's actually a very expensive and time-consuming process. So a Chinese family or individual, for example, would have to launch a successful business, be able to capitalize on that to show that they have a legitimate interest or they have a legitimate benefit to being a U.S. citizen. And then on top of that, the process can take up multiple years and cost over $500,000. So this is a very time-consuming and frankly uncertain way to gain citizenship because there are no guarantees in this entire process. However, with the U.S. surrogacy laws, if a Chinese couple or individual was to hire a U.S. surrogate, create the embryo, and have their biological child, or at least legal child, born in the United States, when that child receives citizenship, it means that the parents, once the child turns 21, can apply for a green card. And so that they're basically guaranteed citizenship over the course of a few years if they're willing to bide their time. And so one father who was being interviewed in one of the NPR articles actually said that in the coming decades, either the United States or China will come out on top as the world leader. And so it benefits me if I have a child with citizenship in the U.S. and I have Chinese citizenship. And if I need to, I can get citizenship through that child in the years to come.
Wow.
So this is a very calculated, for some people, a very calculated way for them to ensure that regardless of how things go politically on the global scale, that hopefully they have the protection they need in one of the given countries.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that's interesting. And that is a different angle because I was thinking about this from the perspective of just kind of national security and if they're, plotting something secretive to take down America, which could be, but at the same time, it could just be that they're putting together a plan in case China goes down, they can still have a footing in America. Which is
right.
Interesting.
And you're absolutely right to also mention the national security angle, which is huge here. So as you mentioned in the introduction, right, we have multiple laws governing the foreign purchase of U.S. land. There's immense focus and scrutiny put on Chinese nationals who are infiltrating academia and research institutions, who are infiltrating land purchases, TikTok, even through Disney, right? Like there are all of these ways with Confucius Institutes in the United States that China is attempting to lay hold of U.S. goods and amass power in the United States, all without firing a single shot right now. So you have the spy balloon or multiple spy balloons that have been now spotted over the U.S. And clearly they're not just sightseeing trips, right? That there's a very intense purpose with this. And so when it comes to the commercial surrogacy business in particular, you're absolutely right that the national security threat here is immense. And here's the distinction. So for example, if a Chinese national comes to the United States, either in college or as a professor or as some sort of businessmen later on. The United States has records of that Chinese national being from China, their education, their background, and like what they're doing here, even if it's for nefarious means. But in the case of the surrogacy, the children born from Chinese nationals have the full rights of U.S. citizenship, which means that if they were to be subverted by China to be some sort of attack or threat to the United States, when they come to work or study in the United States, they're not being flagged as a Chinese national immigrating to the U.S. They're being flagged as a U.S. citizen, even if they've spent the previous 18 to 21 years of their life living in China. And this isn't to say that the CCP's goal was to orchestrate this entire industry, because really Chinese families, individuals are taking advantage of the lax laws that we have here in the United States. Like, we're leaving ourselves open to them being used against us. But there are countless stories we have of even well-meaning Chinese nationals who come to the U.S. to work and genuinely contribute to the nation, later being subverted by the Communist Party of China with threats regarding their family, regarding fortune and well-being, saying like, well, your grandmother's still here in China, and it would be terrible if something bad happened to her. It's better if you pass this information along to us. And so whether or not...
Interesting.
Right. So like, you never know how the CCP could use it, because frankly, even though the United States doesn't know who these children are, it's a very good chance that the Chinese government does, and is probably keeping tabs to think how they could use that to their benefit.
Oh, of course. Of course. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come right back and continue the conversation with Ms. Emma Waters, who is really blowing my mind right now. and we're just in the first segment.
The winningest team in baseball also has the most saves, and people who save the most money are winners. So start earning saves by investing in worthy bonds for only $10 each. These bonds earn a fixed 7% APY, and there's no fees, penalties, or minimum balance required, and they can be redeemed whenever you like. You can even round up everyday purchases to buy additional bonds. Go to worthybonds.com/save. That's worthybonds.com/save, and save and win.
Spring is here and baseball is back.
You can't forget the Derby. I love the hats. Do you have yours yet?
My hat? I treated myself to a whole outfit.
If you want to be able to treat yourself, then you should check out the Nest Savings Account at LGE Community Credit Union, where they want you to reach your savings goals faster.
Take it from a pair of 680 The Fan wives. Head to lgeccu.org to find out what makes their team #1 in Georgia.
Welcome back to Let's Talk About It with Janelle King. I am Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3, and we're talking to Emma Waters, who is the writer of the riveting article, California's New Handmaid's Tale, which discuss China and our US surrogacy program and how they're kind of taking advantage of that, or a lot of taking advantage of that. And before the break, we discussed what inspired her to write this article and just some reasons why we believe this is happening. So we're going to continue the conversation. If you missed that first part, don't worry. You can go to allthingsjking.com, which is my website. And on that website, you can see other ways to listen, because this episode in its entirety will be on my podcast dropping this Tuesday. Now, continuing the conversation, you mentioned that commercial surrogacy is illegal in China, and yet Chinese and American brokers continue to market American uteruses, basically, for Chinese fetuses. So my question is, as you were doing your research, it kind of drove you to California, obviously, as the hub of this program. So what role is California's surrogacy organizations playing as it relates to enabling these practices?
Yes. So in California, there are extensive laws that have actually laid out the rights of commercial surrogacy, or gestational surrogacy, as they call it, for the surrogates and for the intended parents, whether they're domestic or international. And so these laws have actually made it incredibly easy for surrogacy agencies to run their entire business without any sort of legal ambiguity or even barriers to the decisions that they make. And so there are hundreds, if not thousands, of fertility clinics in California. And many boast that because of the way that the legal structure is built in California, that it's the most affordable and easy to access route you can take to creating a child through surrogacy. And so what the surrogates will do, and I actually did a deep dive looking at the top 450 fertility clinics in California, which took quite some time. And I found some rather startling consistencies between all of these organizations or clinics. And so these clinics are U.S.-based clinics, and their role is simply to help intended parents find surrogates. They're not catering towards any nation or our nation in particular. They're just fertility clinics. And many of them also help with the in vitro fertilization process, which is essential in creating and then implanting the embryo in the surrogate. But what I found is that, first of all, the majority of these organizations have multiple language options. And for a lot of them, they only have two language options, one in English and then one in Mandarin or simple Chinese. And again, these are not agencies that are geared towards China. These are just U.S. agencies that happen to only offer two languages. That's weird. English and Chinese, right? Very weird.
Yeah,
and then
you would think it would be Spanish.
Right, exactly. Well, and if you're thinking wealth, it's still, the surrogacy process is still upwards of $225,000. So it's not a cheap process regardless. And so, so it could be Spanish because that one's very common. But if they're thinking about who the majority of their market is, it seems to point to China. And then on top of that, there were multiple agencies that had either a special like Chinese specialist on staff who either lived in China or was fluent in Chinese and able to connect with clients in China very easily, and were clearly geared towards it. A handful of them had done their education in China or run businesses in China before coming to the United States. And so like the layers of connection between the U.S. and China in this market were even more apparent. And as you mentioned coming in, commercial any form of surrogacy, but specifically commercial surrogacy or surrogacy for pay, is explicitly illegal in China. And in 2001, the Communist Party of China even came out with a bold statement saying that they're opposed to this process because of how it exploits the bodies of women and then creates children into products to buy and sell. And it was not something that they were going to stand for. But what's really interesting is I found 3 agencies that are based in California that have 2 locations for their business, one in California and the other either in Shanghai or another province in China.
Oh my goodness.
And so for an industry to be illegal, you still have surrogacy agencies that are quite literally based between the U.S. and China, whose explicit goal is to connect wealthy Chinese patrons with the bodies of American women. And that's to put it bluntly, but I think that is the reality of what's happening here. And so even if these agencies aren't publicly boasting that they're helping Chinese nationals birth children in the United States, a simple look at their website shows that the relationship there is actually much stronger than they've let on. And their job is to facilitate these connections. And what's really interesting to note here is the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, which is the largest, which is, if not the largest, basically the largest reproductive organization in the United States. And they help set forward governing standards that fertility clinics can opt into. And it's important to note that these standards aren't standards that you're legally bound to follow, but it's helpful if you associate yourselves with them because they're the most well-known and ostensibly are in place to help protect people from abuse, coercion, or other negative outcomes. But in the case for the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, they have a group that's called the Chinese Special Interest Group, explicitly devoted to strengthening the relationship between China and the United States when it comes to the facilitation or sharing of research, of clinical trials, and of reproductive technology. And so the largest reproductive organization in the United States has a subgroup that's explicitly tailored towards strengthening this relationship between China and the U.S. without a single caveat, or pause for concern for the national security threats and major issues that could come with this. And until this point, lawmakers have largely left this just left alone and uncovered, and no legal restrictions have been put in place to even govern this practice to ensure that what's happening is above the board and in the best interest of the United States.
Oh, well, of course. I mean, I wish I could say that I'm surprised, but for some reason I am just not. But it's just frustrating. There's this argument, right? So regardless of where you stand on the aisle, this conversation is not about pro-life or pro-choice, but I got to bring in this topic. So the argument around abortion is, and my issue with the argument around abortion is that I feel like we're diluting the power of conception and that we're just kind of reducing life down to a clump of cells is what it's normally said, and ultimately seeing children as commodities. And I know you mentioned that now China is completely against that when it comes to us utilizing their women, but they're okay with utilizing our women rather than just seeing children as precious gifts. So can you discuss some of the implications and potential consequences around treating children as commodities versus gifts? I mean, you touched on it, but I kind of want to go a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a huge issue. And what's so interesting is this is actually the point of this argument that both radical feminists on the one hand and social conservatives on the other come to the same point of agreement on. And that one, it's that it reduces a woman down to one particular part of her body, her ability to conceive and bear children. And that very reductionist view can be exploited because once money is changing hands, this is no longer just an altruistic service that you're doing for goodwill. This is something that you're being paid for. And so all of the effects of coercion and really perversion when it comes to what people desire are easily manipulated the moment money enters. And then the same as with children. There's a long line of thinking that suggests and encourages that the best way to think about children is as a gift. So when it comes to conversations on reproductive rights, the thing that sort of cuts through the my body, my choice is that ultimately children are a gift. And even if they are conceived or are born in the least desirable circumstances, and that certainly occurs, that ultimately children themselves are the innocent party here, and they aren't the ones that the evil should be taken out on. And so when it comes to the surrogacy business, the moment you have a couple or an individual who can purchase the egg or the sperm to create the embryo, who can pay in vitro fertilization technicians to create the embryo and implant it in the surrogate, the moment they pay the surrogate to use her womb and then, of course, cover all of the legal fees, the line between a legitimate fertility treatment and outright baby selling dissolves pretty quickly, because the difference here is that you're paying for all the composite parts of a child, and then at the end of the day, you get to take that child home. And the legal language is very clear on this point, or is at least they're trying the best they can. So, for example, no legal contract says that the parents have paid the surrogate for the baby, because buying the baby is a problem. Instead, legal surrogacy contracts say that the parents are paying the surrogate for her pain and suffering. And what is that quote unquote pain and suffering? It's conception, it's pregnancy, and it's birth. And at the end, they get to take home the child. But that's a very thin line that isn't altogether clear, that we haven't violated in some really meaningful way. And then in doing so, what this means is that children end up being this product that if you have enough money and can pay for all of the parts to create, then you have a right to buy them, regardless of any biological connection, regardless of the intent that you have in place. And so speaking of the in vitro fertilization process, in this process, up to 87% of clinics in the United States offer genetic testing for things like the sex of the baby, the eye color, the hair color, and other secondary attributes. And so, and scientists are already working on editing the genetics of embryos that could make them smarter or kinder or more compassionate. And so, like, really editing the very, like, makeup of this child. And so when it comes to concerns around surrogacy, you see people using it, whether they intend to or not in some circumstances, to order sort of the ideal child and customize or pick the embryo that they think best reflects what they want. But in doing so, again, this is really violating the integrity of the child and what it means to be human, that we receive them as a gift, even if they're not this sort of ideal child that we could imagine. And that's really where a lot of the concerns come from here, because then people are no longer treated with the sort of dignity and respect that they deserve, and instead they're just treated as some sort of market accessory that could benefit the life of another person only insofar as it's desirable. So there are horrible stories, and if you Google, you can see the headlines where couples have sued fertility clinics, and this is the language that they use where, and quote, "We ordered a little boy, but instead our surrogate birthed a girl, and we want our money back."
Oh my gosh.
And this is what the industry does, is because the laws that are in place or not in place shape our values. And so the law is a teacher, right? And so if we allow commercial surrogacy to be this unregulated wild west of reproductive medicine, then the way the laws are functioning are training us to think about human beings as this object that we can order or sell based on adult desire, rather than a gift that we are to receive with open arms and care for, because that is our moral responsibility and our duty to fellow human beings.
Yeah, and when you start seeing children as commodities, you don't care for them the way that you would if you, like you said, if we saw them as a gift. And so one of my goals with this show is that I like to target millennials and Gen Zers, because I feel like we get left out of conversations because there's an assumption that we either don't care, we don't know enough, and all that other stuff. But I feel like, between both generations, there's a deep connection to the humanitarian side. And you touched on that when you were just speaking a few moments ago. And I think that it's uncomfortable for some people to believe that, that we should focus on feelings. There are a lot of generations that feel like it's, talking about the humanitarian side of things is just focusing too much on the feelings. But I think our forefathers had a lot of foresight when it came to this, because there's sovereignty laws, right, against being able to, we can break sovereignty laws if that means that another country is now invoking things and putting things on people that is against humanitarian rights. And that's the reason why, it's because of stuff like this. So before we go into what are some other humanitarian threats, what are some topics that we can talk to our younger generation about when it comes to this and kind of connecting it to national security, you mentioned paying for the egg. So I was under the assumption that these were married couples who the mom went through the IVF process in China, and then the dad did his thing, and then they created the embryo, and the embryo was placed inside of a marriage. But what is the paying for eggs?
Oh, yes. And this stumbles across one of the worst parts of the industry. So, yes, there are certainly instances where a married couple creates an embryo with the wife's egg and the husband's sperm to birth a child. But there are no legal requirements that this is the case. And frankly, a lot of times reproductive technology is used when there is not a marriage between two people, so that there's actually a legitimate, beyond perhaps infertility or a concern on the wife's part, that there's just not a spouse to create with. So it's incredibly common with commercial surrogacy for either a single male to use his sperm, purchase an egg, and create a child, or same-sex couples to do so. And so in the United States, and this is, of course, a global business, but particularly in the United States, there are many industries that are devoted to buying eggs from young women. So you'll see, and I'm sure, especially if you're Gen Z, and you've ever been on a college campus or in a metropolitan area, you've likely received ads for selling your eggs. It's a cheap and easy, or not a cheap process, but it's an easy process, and you'll make thousands of dollars. And so one of my roommates actually looked into this process before she understood what it entailed, and they're willing to pay up to $30,000 to harvest eggs from young women. And so in doing so, the young women have to go through an extensive medical background check, and then they use different drugs, including Lupron. And Lupron, if you're familiar, is one of the key drugs that's actually used to block puberty when it comes to transgenderism and gender dysphoria. So this is an incredibly strong hormonal drug that's used to hyperstimulate ovarian production in a woman. And so normally a woman would produce one egg in a given month. But with this procedure, they actually manipulate a young woman's body to produce 10, 15, 20, even 30 eggs at one time.
Oh my God.
Which is completely unnatural. Then they harvest all of those eggs and pay her accordingly for them. Now, there have been a lot of reports collected by the Center for Bioethics and Culture in California that show that not only are there serious medical concerns and serious moral concerns with this business, but that there are actually young women who have died from complications from hyperstimulating their ovarian system like that, such that there can be bleeding and swelling and even higher chances of cancer or infertility on the part of women who donate. But still, this isn't discussed. It's just viewed as another part of this reproductive market. So then the eggs are purchased from the young woman, and then they go into either they go into egg donation banks, or if it's from a man, they go into sperm banks. And so potential parents who are looking to create a child through IVF and surrogacy actually can look through these books of people, and it shows the picture of the woman or man if it's a sperm bank, and then it shows basic facts about them. So how tall are they? What color is their skin, their eye, their hair? Are they athletic? Where did they get their degrees? Do they have any special strengths or talents? And not surprisingly, the eggs that they charge the most money for are eggs of women from Ivy League institutions or white or Asian backgrounds, because they perceive those to be the strongest and most fit. So there's a serious eugenic component to this, where you don't see many eggs coming from African American or Indian women, and you see this bias against that, and instead they're targeting particular kinds of women. And then at that point, the parents can purchase the eggs that they ideally want their child to come from, which again has a major eugenic perspective, because we're creating children from a particular race or educational background, imbuing a greater value or worth onto those eggs than, say, another's, which is incredibly problematic.
Goodness. Well, that goes back to that humanitarian issue.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And then from there, right. So, and again, the amount of money that is embedded in this entire system is just unspeakable, because a single round of in vitro fertilization just to create one embryo can cost up to $30,000.
Oh, I understand.
So again, just the money and the eugenics side of this, and just the concerns when it comes to egg buying are huge, because it's incredibly dangerous, and again, just contributes to all of the worst parts of humanity, especially when it's abused and not regulated like it is in the United States.
This is interesting, because we have a lot of conversation around, whether or not the population is too high, the whole population control conversation and all of that stuff. But yet we don't have a problem with this. And what I find fascinating about this is that prior to this conversation, I thought that that they were the surrogates were producing just Chinese babies, right? But now it's we don't even know, right? I mean, it's kind of it could be a mixture of all different ethnicities, and but the dads Chinese, or what's the advantage?
Yeah, so I now again, as I mentioned, this is not a regulated industry in the United States, so there is very little tracking or reporting, aside from maybe the individual fertility clinic and the records that they keep, but that's not available to the U.S. government and certainly not available to the public. So in many instances, if it's coming from a couple in China, unless the woman's eggs are not viable or able to be used, chances are they're going to use their own DNA, right? Now, when it comes to the U.S., and now if they can't use the woman's eggs, or if it's a single man, for example, from China, they could hire a Chinese, they could purchase Chinese eggs. So a Chinese college student at Berkeley in California, right, sells her eggs. And so they could still have a child that whose ethnicity is Chinese. And frankly, from what I've read or what I've heard from talking to fertility clinics, the Chinese are a very race-conscious people, and so they want to keep I think the ethnicity as close to Chinese as possible. But I have read and heard from talking to certain people instances where they would choose an egg that comes from a Caucasian American if they're wanting to create a child that looks fairly Chinese but has like the height of Americans or has other attributes that they're hoping to blend. And so sometimes there is an intentional selection of another ethnicity attempting to create a sort of like superhuman or just like like whatever benefits that they want to imbue with that child. So it can go either way. And frankly, like that's just how it comes down to, because you can really customize this child as much as within your power and within your budget to do so. There's any number of ways that this could go, even outside of just the traditional Chinese couple creates a child using their own DNA.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to go to a break really quickly, and then we're going to have the final segment where we're going to conclude with Emma Waters. I promise I could talk to you for like hours. This is such a good topic. And I mean, I've learned so much, and I know everyone who's listening has as well. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we come back. We're going to conclude this conversation.
The winningest team in baseball also has the most saves, and people who save the most money are winners. So start earning saves by investing in worthy bonds for only $10 each. These bonds earn a fixed 7% APY, and there's no fees, penalties, or minimum balance required, and they can be redeemed whenever you like. You can even round up everyday purchases to buy additional bonds. Go to worthybonds.com/save. That's worthybonds.com/save, and save and win.
Spring is here and baseball is back.
You can't forget the Derby. I love the hats. Do you have yours yet?
My hat? I treated myself to a whole outfit.
If you want to be able to treat yourself, then you should check out the Nest Savings Account at LGE Community Credit Union, where they want you to reach your savings goals faster.
Take it from a pair of 680 The Fan wives. Head to lgeccu.org to find out what makes their team #1 in Georgia.
Welcome back to Let's Talk About It with Janelle King. Again, I am your host, Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3. And if you're joining us for the first time and you feel like, oh my God, I missed the entire show, yes, you have, but it's okay, because you can listen to the full episode of this podcast the full episode of this radio show on my podcast, Let's Talk About It with Janelle King. And you can go to my website, allthingsjking.com. There's a lot of J King. I've been saying that a lot. So, all right, allthingsjking.com is the website. And again, the full episode of this podcast will be uploaded on Tuesday. So this coming Tuesday, you'll be able to listen to it. So we have the final hour. Again, I am with Miss Emma Waters, who wrote the article that really grabbed me, California's New Handmaid's Tale. That is actually, I put a link to the article on my website under Fave Reads. And so you can read it yourself and share it and make sure that you are talking about this. So I wanted to end this conversation with one final question, although I have a ton more. But is notable legal and policy developments. Have you heard, or in your research, did you come across anyone or anything or any organization that's working on trying to put forth any type of regulations or policy developments since this has come to light?
So since this issue in particular has come to light, there has not been a push from state or federal lawmakers to pass any laws regulating this industry. And this is a large part of what my platform at the Heritage Foundation is devoted to, is really bringing awareness to this issue, as well as thinking of creative policy mechanisms that could be put in place to regulate it. And again, this really doesn't come down to whether or not you're in support of commercial surrogacy or not, but it comes down to the national security concerns and the moral responsibility we have towards this practice and towards the children that are created. So one policy that I have spoken with lawmakers and have written about in other locations is the American Foreign Investment Disclosure Act. And this law is a law that's in place, federally enacted, that basically says that any foreign national who purchases farmland in the United States must be added to this registry or database so that we know who they are, where they've purchased land, and basic information about them, so that we have tabs on the people who really have a stake in the U.S. And so one law that policymakers could consider when it comes to this international surrogacy industry is instituting a similar database where foreign nationals who either create embryos in the United States and certainly who hire surrogates and birth children here would go into the database so that we know who these parents or individual or couple is, that we know who the child is that's being born from this process, and what country they're going back to live in, so that we know what nation's values and laws and interests that they're being the most influenced by. And so that would be one way that we would simply enact reporting and tracking on this industry. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of money embedded in this entire industry. And so really the reproductive organizations and those who are funding them have a vested interest in ensuring that as little regulation is passed as possible. So some of you may have seen the Netflix documentary about the sperm donation doctor who was actually responsible for switching out the sperm of fathers or the selected sperm from a sperm bank and using his own sperm in the creation of hundreds of children. And this is something that other sperm doctors have unfortunately done as well, just like really further corrupting our understanding of children and the entire industry here. And so even with something so clearly evil as that, reproductive groups have worked really hard to push back on any federal and state legislation that would require, that would basically ban that practice altogether. So it's just appalling, I think, and that's something that I think really like lawmakers need to come to terms with, is that the reason you're not hearing more about this is because there are multiple reproductive technology agencies who have bases in Washington, D.C. that are filled with lobbyists whose one priority is to ensure that lawmakers spend as little time regulating this as possible. And this might not always be for terrible outcomes, but certainly the byproduct of this is that we do leave people and the children that are being created very vulnerable to abuse.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue that I think we should harp on. I mean, listening to everything that you provided us, I feel like if we can come from the humanitarian side of this, we may be able to get more people talking about it. And what we've learned is that when the court of public opinion's involved, it typically does shift some things. It's not always for the better, but it does. I'm so grateful for you, and thank you for lending your time and your expertise. I want to continue to follow your articles and follow your work. Can you please tell our listeners how they can find more of your articles and kind of follow you as we are continuing this conversation and into some of your other topics?
Yes, absolutely. So if you want to find of my articles are published on this topic and more, you can search the Heritage Foundation and Emma Waters, and there you'll see my research page with all of my pieces that are done, or you can follow me on Twitter at EML Waters. But one particular article I want to draw listeners' attention to is one that I wrote for the Federalist back in April, and it's entitled China's stateside rent-a-womb industry poses yet another national security nightmare. Quite the mouthful. But this piece in particular, I go into even more detail and include links and data points for a lot of the things that I've discussed in this interview. And so that would provide even more resources and insight into this issue.
Absolutely. Well, I'm certainly going to go and read that article and more of your articles because, for one, the thing I love the most about your article is that it was digestible. It felt like no matter how involved or not involved you are with this subject, it felt like we can still be involved in the conversation. It was easy to grasp, and I appreciate that. So as I read more of Emma's articles, I'm definitely going to add links on my website as well to her articles so that you can read them as well, and that we can really push it out there. There needs to be more conversation around this. I know this feels overwhelming. I think when we talk about China, it's extremely overwhelming from time to time. And the answer is yes, it is, right? But that doesn't mean that just because it feels this way that we have to check out. We can't check out. We've got to make sure we stay involved in this conversation because they're clearly continuing to innovate, continuing to come up with ways to invade our country. Ask questions, have courage, be willing to fight back when necessary. I think we need to continue to just keep talking about this. So Emma and I talked about it, and we all talked about it as you're listening, whether you were talking with me or talking to your friends around you. We're all talked about it, so now you go talk about it. I will see everyone next week. Again, thank you, Emma, and we will continue to have more riveting conversations. So, toodles.
The winningest team in baseball also has the most saves, and people who save the most money are winners. So start earning saves by investing in worthy bonds for only $10 each. These bonds earn a fixed 7% APY, and there's no fees, penalties, or minimum balance required, and they can be redeemed whenever you like. You can even round up everyday purchases to buy additional bonds. Go to worthybonds.com/save. That's worthybonds.com/save and save and win.
It's March, and we all know what that means. College basketball.
I know there are teams looking for a bump, but did you know that our friends at LGE Community Credit Union have a bump rate program for their CDs? If you have a CD with them and rates increase during the term, you have one chance to bump your rate, giving you the power to earn even more.
Take it from a pair of 680 The Fan wives. Head to lgeccu.org to find out what makes LGE number one in Georgia.
The Fan is ready for Brave season. Are you?
3-1 smoked high in the air, deep center field, and heading for the horizon. A home run by Olsen.
We're streaming every game of the Braves 2024 season free on the 680 The Fan app.
So make sure you download it now and don't miss a pitch of the Braves this season.